These modules have been created by a team of experts, and Nikki and I have been really fortunate to be on these panels and working with incredible academics, teachers, and everything in between to pull together the latest research in this space. And some of it may be really new to you. Some of it you may have covered in some point in your journey, but we really hope that you can embrace, enjoy, please ask questions. As I mentioned, I have come into this piece as one of the regional coordinators for the Logan schools, but I'm also a primary school teacher like you guys, and I'm a dietitian. And so putting on all of those hats has been, hey Jeanette, thanks for joining us, has been a really fantastic experience so far on the pick of the crop journey. And this to me is the next exciting step. We have been really lucky to have Nikki Boswell, who you can also see on screen, as part of this experience as well. And Nikki is a PhD qualified public health nutritionist. She comes to us as well with a secondary teaching background. So she currently teaches home ec, and she told me today tourism at Harvey Bay State High School. And in her spare time, she's also an expert on child feeding. And so we've been so lucky to have Nikki on this dream team pulling these modules together for us all. So without any further ado, I'd love to open our first enrichment module with a very special acknowledgement of country.
Thank you so much, Kat. So there we go. So Health and Wellbeing Queensland respectfully acknowledges traditional owners and custodians of the land from across Queensland. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, for they are the holders of the memories, traditions, the cultures and the aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Queensland.
Thanks, Nikki.
Sorry, did you want to take this one? That was like you? No? Okay. So what we're actually just going to ask you to do before we get going is, if you don't mind, jump through to this Mentimeter, and we've just got a few foundation questions in there that we're hoping you can answer. It's going to help us get a really good idea of how we're going and actually helping you build your food literacy skills and knowledge. So we've got the link there to pop straight into the chat box as well, or you can just type it into your search bar if you've got a phone there as a second device. We'll be able to get on over there, answer some of those questions. Thanks so much, Kat, for popping that in. Just to get some of that background knowledge before we get going.
I'm going to share my screen so we can actively see how we're going with these questions.
If you're having any issues getting in, just let us know.
So hopefully we'll see some of these bars begin to dance as people get into Menti and start to share some of their thoughts. And there is no expectations here, we should add.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So we really want to know, where you're at currently. Obviously, that gives us some direction on where to lead our conversation discussion today, and hopefully be able to show how much we have contributed and added to your knowledge in this space, or where we might need to provide some additional resources and things like that.
Yeah, so fantastic. We've got 4 people in there already that have been able to share some of their thoughts around their current level of knowledge in relation to these different topics that we're going to cover over the next few weeks.
It's fantastic to see such high responses in that sustainability perspective. I'm wondering how much might be attributed to the pick of the crop work already done.
I'm wondering too. So we've had 6 people respond. We'll just leave it open for another 30 seconds or so before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, we've had a few additional people join us as well. So for those people who've just jumped in, there's a link there, join the Mentimeter to give us a little bit of background information. And if that's not enough to do to get you going, you can also pop in the chat box where you're from. Would be great.
Fantastic. So as you were saying, Nikki, people are feeling fairly knowledgeable in that area of sustainability. a little bit less in food literacy and our age-appropriate food and nutrition-related pedagogies. And then for our First Nations or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, we're around the 2.4. So this is fantastic, and we're really excited to take you guys on this journey and to see where we can get these bars to towards the end of the next few weeks together.
Absolutely. And yeah, just so those are 4 topics there. Essentially, those are the things that we've identified or that you told us were areas that you wanted to develop your skills in. So that is what our 3 modules are going to look at and focus over the next few weeks. So it would be great to see how this data changes.
Absolutely. So we've had 9 people respond. Nikki, I can't see how many friends we've got in the webinar at the moment, but I might move to the next slide unless there's a lot more that we are waiting on answering.
A few more that haven't, but I think we can probably move on if you like. They might have just joined us and missed some of those foundation instructions.
That's okay. We'll go on to slide number 2. And if you have just joined us, it's not too late to jump into this survey here. This one is around rating your current confidence, including the following in your professional practice. So the first question was knowledge-based, but how confident do you feel around the areas of food literacy? Again, the age-appropriate food and nutrition pedagogy, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, and the sustainability perspectives. So give us a little bit of an idea on that scale again, if you don't mind. Thank you. Here we go. It's so interesting seeing the images dance around as people start to input their thoughts. Thanks, guys.
As while we're doing this, it's a great time to also set that expectation that we really would like you guys to collaborate and contribute to this session as much as possible, to utilise that chat box as much as you can to ask us questions as we go through. We've tried to include lots of opportunity for you to contribute some thoughts and answers and things like that. But if stuff does come up that you want to just clarify, if I'm not making sense, which happens, please just pop it in the chat box or give me a little confused face if I've lost you there, and let me know, and we can go back and try and make sure we clarify it all for you.
Thanks, Nikki. So I can see we've had about 6 people responding to this question. I'll leave it open for another 30 seconds or so to see if anyone else would like to submit their thoughts around confidence.
Got a bit of scouting going on there on the side as well.
All right, we'll move on to the last question. And this one's around how often do you include the following in your professional teaching practice? So food literacy, again, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Nations perspectives, and sustainability perspectives. Oops, sorry. We've got some numbers starting to come through already. Again, it's that sustainability piece that seems to be a little more easily incorporated at the moment.
Yeah, for a moment there, our food literacy and First Nations perspectives were neck and neck.
It's like watching a horse race or something, isn't it?
It did feel a bit like a commentator there, yes.
Yes, exactly. So we've had 8 people jump in so far and let us know where they're at with the inclusion.
The link for the question, Charlene, is that specifically this third one or the link for the Menti altogether? It's a bit hard to get responses to such a long open question there, wasn't it? I'll have to work on that phrasing.
I'll leave it open for a little bit longer in case Charlene can still contribute.
So, yeah, all sorted now then? Yeah. Hello, Wendy, you've just joined us as well.
Hi, Wendy. All right, this is fantastic. Thank you so much, guys, for contributing to these initial, let's call them pre-workshop questions. And as Nikki identified, we will be checking in towards the end as well to see where are we at after these next 3 to 4 hours together.
Not all today.
Not all today.
Just to clarify that. So as we're getting back over to our PowerPoint slides there that Kat's driving for us, we're just going to get you to tell us a little bit about what brings you here today. What are you hoping to get from these workshops, or what's your sort of foundation perspectives coming into these modules? So we don't have the slides back up there yet, Kat.
They're coming.
Sorry, we've been a bit impatient. So if you want to type into the chat box there what's brought you here, what you might be hoping to get out of it, or Steve's posting some comments there. Steve's
there you go. Maybe Nikki, if you're prepared to drive down to Hervey Bay.
Out to Bundy? Yeah, if anyone. Oh. I do know of one in Maryborough, Steve. Might be a little far.
Good opportunity to network here during the
absolutely
during our
so we might just skip ahead and get some ideas going around this topic. So some of you might be in here thinking, well, what is food literacy anyway? I'm sure you get drummed with a lot of other literacy words and concepts and agendas, and this might seem like another one to add to it. We're hoping to present this in a way that isn't going to add another framework to your current workload, but rather give you some tools to embed this really important teaching and learning area into your professional practices. So we've got Sue there, hoping to learn more about how to implement into your teaching. Fantastic. That is specifically what we're going to cover in great depth in Module 2. So today we're really going to give you some foundation understanding and background before we really get into that. So often when people come into food and nutrition learning space and food literacy learning spaces, there's sometimes this idea around they already know a lot about it because, you know, we all eat. And as true as that is, and it is very, very valuable and important, we all do bring our life experiences to this. There is a whole world of research and literature and professionals that dedicate huge amounts of time to this space as well. So we're hoping to share some of those perspectives with you as well. I'm just reading the chat box still, but we're still just looking for employment. And the last one there we thought might be relevant is where does the teacher's role with food start and finish? So if this is something that's been on your mind and maybe impacting on that confidence you have in this professional space, this is something that we're hoping to cover a little bit of in these modules as well. Happy to move forward from there, Kat?
Absolutely. And I did just notice Sue shared in the chat that she's here hoping to learn more about how to implement this into her teaching.
Yes, excellent. All right, so jumping forward. So this is our first of our 3 modules as Kat has introduced for us. So today we're really looking at that foundation knowledge about food literacy, the importance of it within our practice, the importance of it for our students and our communities, and the ways that we can communicate around that importance. Once we have this foundation in place, we will jump in to how to actually really implement it within our teaching practices in those age-appropriate ways, and that's next week in Module 2, and making sure we're still aligning with our Australian curriculum as we need to be doing. And then to finish off this learning series, we're going to look at what we call systems competencies, and we'll explain what that is a lot more as we go through this module, but that's where we bring in those First Nations and sustainability perspectives to look at. So today it is that foundation of food literacy and around the importance of communicating our food literacy. So within this first objective, we're going to unpack what food literacy is, why food literacy is important, and what the dimensions of food literacy are. So we did send you out some pre-reading materials, which you completely understand you haven't had the opportunity to really get yourself involved with yet. But we will refer back to this participant manual, or workbook rather. If you haven't accessed that yet, there was an email sent just before our webinar kicked off, and it is also in the handout section, which hopefully you can see. We've got some chat boxes, or next to the chat box across the top, there is a tab there, and it is in there. So that one is going to be important to provide a bit more information about some of the things that we're talking about. And this is going to help us to keep to time today as well, and give you those really valuable resources to go back to. So, more questions for you guys. There is space for you to answer this in your workbook, but we really would like you to get involved in using the chat function here and sharing your responses so that we can all see how we're going and we can all learn from each other. What do you currently know and understand about food literacy? So if you're looking at it in your workbook, you're looking at page 2. If you just want to follow along and use the chat box today, have a think about it, pop your answer in there. It is sometimes a bit of a hard, abstract question to try and quantify. So even if you just want to give us some, an emoji response, do you feel good about your current level of understanding? Are you a bit confused? Depends. I'm just reading some answers here. We're still talking about Bundaberg moving. They've got a great pick of the crop program up there, so I hear. So we'll just wait a few minutes for some responses to that first question. What do you currently understand about food literacy? Kat, did you have a model response for this one as well?
Oh, I'm working on mine right now.
Are you doing it? Kat's all over it. Excellent. Thank you so much, Kat.
No problem.
So the second question there, I'm not sure whether Kat's going to give us a model response with all three.
I'm doing all three. Yes.
All three. Okay. So here we go. Still breaking it down. Just simple enough for young kids sometimes. Absolutely. When we're looking at food, nutrition, food literacy, we are delving into some very abstract concepts sometimes. So really breaking it down to what they can understand and what they need to know, I think, is really important as well. The cooking part, kid-friendly meals that they can do themselves. Absolutely. It's every parent's struggle as well. And getting them to clean up afterwards too. I don't think we have best practice around that yet. It's trying to get kids to clean is always a challenge. So you can go on to the second question if you've given some response there. What do you not understand or what do you struggle with, which is what we're starting to get through as well. And what skills and knowledge would help you, do you think? So any of those questions in any order would be great to get some conversation going. Here we go. So growing and understanding how to connect. This is Kat's amazing model response. Food and nutrition meaningfully to the classroom and outdoor curriculum. How to embed age-appropriate pedagogies, particularly after studying clinical dietetics. All of these modules, thank you. I hope all of these modules do absolutely help you to develop these skills and knowledge.
And I will just touch on that second point around, we briefly mentioned, the way that we may have received nutrition information in the past, and myself, as I have just shared in the chat through studying to be a clinical dietitian, is very different to how we should really be approaching this information sharing using age-appropriate pedagogies. And so this has been quite a steep learning curve for myself, but I'm absolutely loving it. And I'm just getting more and more excited about how we can really, as Steve mentioned, break these concepts down in a way that kids can connect to. And I mentioned earlier that, there are a lot of resources that are available out there, but I think where they're not quite hitting the mark is in this age-appropriate pedagogy space. So I'm really excited to learn more about that particular part of embedding curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit on something that I was going to go into a little bit later, but you've really segued us in there. And that's that idea around moving away from what we call those biomedical perspectives, which is probably very much what you would have experienced in your clinical dietetic setting. And it's often those messages that are really ingrained with a lot of the materials and resources that are currently out there. And so they're very much focused on those physical health elements of nutrition, which definitely do have their really important roles. But we know that food is so much more than that. And, which is really why we're trying to embrace that food literacy framework and the food literacy frame through these modules to really emphasize the breadth of value and importance that food can bring to people physically, communities, families, all of those things, the environment. So Carol's also just put in there about Indigenous foods, about the food sources of the local areas. Yeah, that's a big challenge for lots of people. Absolutely agree with you on that one.
And Carol, if you haven't already connected with the School Garden Masterclass, which has come up a couple of times, primary school language. Ooh,
high school language. Sorry, that's probably more nutrition language. So biomedical perspectives is probably the word that I use, and I did mean to break that down. So it's really those physical health dimensions and really reducing food to its nutritional components and looking at food purely from that perspective. Did that help to clarify that? I knew as soon as I said it that I needed to come back to that. I hope that helped break that down. Yep, excellent. All right, if anyone else has anything to add into that, please feel free to contribute. Otherwise, we'll keep moving forward, I think.
Fantastic.
All right, so this does bring us to then what we are talking about when it comes to food literacy. So food literacy is this term that encapsulates a set of food-related competencies, its knowledge, its skills, its attitudes, its values to enhance health and well-being. So that is kind of what I was talking about there, moving away from food as purely something that is a vessel for nutrients. It's far more than that to so many people. It's far more than that in our daily lives. And that's what food literacy is really about. So Cullen and his colleagues in 2015 defined it as the ability of an individual to understand food in a way that they develop a positive relationship with it, including food skills and practices across the lifespan in order to navigate, engage, and participate within a complex food system. It's the ability to make decisions to support, sorry, I just need to give that to you, the ability to make decisions to support the achievement of personal health and a sustainable food system, considering environmental, social, economic, cultural, and political components. So it is quite an in-depth definition there. What I'm hoping you might be able to do is take a look at that definition across those two lines there, two paragraphs there, and have a think about what words in there really sort of stood out and emphasise what this idea of food literacy is. So you can just pop in the chat box either single words or phrases, so the components of that definition that are meaningful and important that you think. And again, there is some space.
If I can just
on page 9.
Oh, sorry. If I can start with an example as well, Nikki.
Yeah.
When you say the words positive relationship, that really resonates with me.
Yep. Charlene has just popped that one up in the chat box as well. Positive relationships with food. Absolutely. Decision making. Yep.
Absolutely.
We are faced with, there is a number, but I can't remember, lots of food choices absolutely every day. Positive relationships as well. Lifespan, yeah. Food practices and skills. Perfect. Yeah, I think that across the lifespan there is another one for me that really resonates. We're not talking about developing a skill that sticks with our students through their childhood and then is forgotten. We're really building foundation, adult competencies and life skills. And we do need to be beginning in these early parts of their life and childhood because of these decision-making elements. These decisions do stick with us every single day of our lives. So that's another one for me, absolutely, that I agree with, Steve. And the practical elements we've got there. Anything else? Nothing from the second half of the definition there. Direct attention.
Yeah, decision making again.
It doesn't surprise me that the second half of the definition. So I'm lost with the soil health. Sustainable food systems. Yep, so this is what I was just about to say. It doesn't surprise me that the second half of the definition might be resonating less with you. And, you know, the second half there is really around what we are talking about with our food systems, and that's that paddock to plate or soil to stomach type idea where we really start to bring in those sustainability elements. So, Carol, you've got the question there about soil health. That's certainly something that falls in under those sustainability elements and ensuring that whole paddock to plate system is of a high nutritional value. But it's also certainly far more than that. If we're just thinking about it in those nutritional compositions, it does start to fall back to that biomedical idea where we're looking very much at the nutrition, but we're also talking about biodiversity. We're talking about the social justice aspects of that, and, you know, is the ethical aspects around that as well. So it becomes a really, really broad definition. There is a checklist. So we've broken this definition down far further in our participant workbook or our manual that we've got there. And we are going to look at this again further in detail. Sorry, I'm just reading. Improving soil health for the food stream. Absolutely, yes. So it is part of it, but we're also going a bit broader than that. So we've got in the middle of the slide here what we're referring to as our food literacy competency framework. So this is a really nice little graphic way to pull together 3 competency areas around food literacy. So we've got functional competencies around confidence and empowerment with food, and those things are really around your cooking and food practice skills. We've got the rational competency, which is about finding joy and meaning within food and eating occasions. So those are more of those social and cultural connections to food and eating experiences. And then the last one down the bottom there is probably really what this second half of the definition was connecting with, and that's our systems competencies. So this is a connection with culture and community and those food systems, how we get food, how we generate food in ways that are environmentally sustainable, in ways that do promote high quality food, and in ways that promote and sustain culture and meaningful connections with food and food identity. How did I go there? Did I cover everything in a somewhat coherent way?
I think so, Nikki. Well done. So Glenys has just shared some stories from Logan City Special School, and at their school, students are encouraged to grow their own food from seeds and seedlings and have ownership of food from scratch. We use sustainable and organic practices and consider it a social activity as well as educational and nutritional.
Perfect.
Textbook example.
Food literacy at its finest. I really love the word ownership in that, and that's certainly a really powerful encompassing term of what we're looking at with food literacy.
And I have been very lucky to see that in action at Logan City Special School. So Glenys is doing some wonderful work out there.
Fantastic. So just very last thing on this slide. So this is the framework and the overarching model that we're using throughout all 3 of our modules through Pick of the Crop. So you will come back to this and you will develop probably a bit more familiarity with it. You'll definitely see the graphic again. And as I said, a little bit later in this webinar, we will unpack each of those competencies in a bit more depth. So here we go. They're the ones that we highlighted as well. And I think we ticked off all of those, and I think I've talked through them all at this stage. So just to really reiterate why this is so important for us to be looking at, when we focus on food literacy, the evidence shows us that food literacy improves children's willingness to try fruits and vegetables. It improves dietary intake more generally. It improves nutritional knowledge and self-efficacy. It improves attitudes about consuming local fruits and vegetables, and it improves psychological well-being. So there are a range of benefits from taking this far broader food literacy perspective. And that's what we just got a final note there. These are those things that extend well beyond just the physical realms of health, but to those social, emotional, spiritual, and mental dimensions of our health as well. Further to this, it is really important to be focusing on food literacy because at the moment we've got 5% of our Queensland children meeting their recommended intakes of vegetables. We've got 32% of our Queensland children meeting recommended intakes of fruit, and 33 to 41% of the daily energy of Australian children coming from discretionary foods. So we're not really seeing food literacy competencies in practice yet with this kind of data. Very quickly before we move on, what in this information here did you find interesting or relevant or was new information to you that you might not have been aware of?
I think for me, the most shocking statistics are around that idea of vegetables and 5% of kids in Queensland meeting that recommendation. And I think it's also, we know that there's lots of reasons behind that, but you know, to meet the recommended intake of vegetables, you know, it really has to be incorporated, you know, multiple times across the day as well. And so, you know, it's how do we make veggies a hero, and how do we get it into, you know, potentially more than one out of lunch and dinner, and maybe even into breakfast. And what about for our snacks as well?
Yeah. And I'm just looking at Steve's comments there that he thinks that the 33 to 41% of discretionary energy coming from discretionary foods might be a bit of an underestimation. And it doesn't surprise me. There's no surprise about the discretionary foods. I get them back in the lunchbox, sounds me. Yep, absolutely. And I think Kat's phrasing there about heroing vegetables is taken straight from MasterChef, but definitely a really valid and important point that we certainly want to be focusing on. All right. Oh, we've got a couple more. The data, students' lunchboxes daily. Yep, fruit and veg refusal.
Yeah, and Steve is talking about a beautiful story from one of our Logan schools, Berrinbar East State School, where one of the prep classes, Michelle, and I think she's in here with us too, have a veggie garden plot outside their classroom. And Michelle has told me that on average between 5 and 8 kids every lunchtime ask if they can pick some lettuce from the garden and add it to their sandwich. And I just think that's
amazing.
Such a beautiful story, and it goes in with what Glenys was saying before about that ownership. So these students have, you know, nurtured these plants, and they are so excited about it, and to put something green in their sandwich, I just think it's a beautiful story. So thanks, Steve, and thanks, Michelle.
Absolutely, and such a perfect age to really start to be honing those skills and that sense of connection with their food and where it comes from. You know, as children do get older, me sitting at the high school end, they do lose that joy for the simple things. I also just wanted to jump back there. Carol had fruit break in there. Fruit break is definitely a great example of something that can help. There's a lot of peer role modeling going along in that situation. So some of these things that you're touching on there, improving parents' food literacy as well as the fruit break idea, these are things that we're actually going to come back to the second part of this webinar when we look at how to communicate the importance of food literacy. So I really want you to hold on to those ideas and come back to it. And then we've also got here the cost of vegetables is an issue or an excuse. Seasonal
not an issue.
It's not, I've got to read things correctly. It's not an issue or excuse. Very affordable and cheaper in markets. Yep, so you're hitting right on there around some of those systems competencies possibly, as well as some of those values and attitudes and that we place on food, whether people, you know, prioritize it in their life or not.
Some of those myths, I think, too. There's lots of myths around.
Absolutely.
Fresh food being expensive.
Something that we are going to, I know we've got some information on in a few slides' time.
We do.
Tried to do a PD for parents a few years ago. One showed up. Yeah. Yeah, welcome to the world of nutrition, Steve. So you're hitting on some really great points there, and I'm really glad we're getting some thoughts and thinking around this going. And we'll move on to have a look at what we've got that's going to help clarify and touch on some of these points as well. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually look at when we say we've got children who are not meeting those recommendations, 95% of them. Well, where do we find those recommendations? What is it that we are recommending for children and for adults to eat? And so that information is set out in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, as well as the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So it provides detailed information. There is detailed information in your booklets on page 3 and 4, so you can go back to this and unpack it. But it is a model that provides a foundation of more of those biomedical, so more of those nutrition-based ideas and concepts about food. But it is a foundation that we carry across the breadth of that food literacy model. So it is based on credible government-endorsed information. I'm just reading the chat box as we go as well. So within this model, we've got the 5 food groups conceptualized, and they're represented in the proportions that they are encouraged to be eaten in each day. So at the top of the model there, we've got our grains food group in a large portion, as well as our vegetable food group in a large proportion of that plate, so to speak. Down the bottom there are other 3 food groups, and you can see that those proportionally are represented in smaller amounts. So the idea is there that we eat those in small amounts. What I did want to really point out and emphasize in this model, I'm sure you've all seen it before. Maybe give us a thumbs up. Thumbs up if you've seen it before. But what I really wanted to emphasize is that this model, it's a food selection guide that's designed to be interpreted by adults. It's not necessarily designed for children and to be interpreted by children. But us as teachers and as adults do need to understand how to interpret the information in this guide so that then we can translate it into what is going to be age-appropriate ways. Fantastic. Lots and lots of thumbs up there coming through. A couple of things that I did want to emphasize in this model that we do all seem to have a fairly good familiarity with it. They use this guide in a Year 3 health unit. Yep, it is explicitly referred to in our curriculum. So I'll just leave that there. What I did want to emphasize is that down the bottom here, we've got 2 of the food groups, milk, cheese, yogurt, and alternatives. And it's really important that we do refer to that food group as milk, cheese, yogurts, and alternatives, and not dairy foods, which often happens. Sometimes our dairy foods, or not sometimes, some of our dairy foods don't actually fit within that food group model. So remember that this model is based on grouping foods based on their nutrient profile, and things like ice cream and cream that are dairy foods don't actually fit within that food group. They do sit outside the plate and sit within what is called our discretionary foods. And likewise, milk alternative sources that are calcium fortified can fit within this food group. So by allowing this flexibility in that food group and ensuring it is focusing on the calcium intake there, it does mean that people who are vegetarian and vegan or lactose intolerant or dairy, have allergies to dairy, can still eat and fulfill what is prescribed as the recommended intake based on this model. That's similar there to our meats and alternative food group. So we do have the flexibility in there to include things like lentils, legumes, tofu, those non-meat sources of protein and those other essential nutrients to make sure that we can reach groups of people who might not consume animal-based products. Did you want to add anything in there as well, Kat?
No.
Were there any questions on interpreting the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating before we move on? I did think that most people would be familiar with it to a certain degree, and I did just want to emphasise those 2 points about making sure we call those. Why? Yep, that's our very next slide, Steve. Thanks. Oh, fantastic. So Steve is jumping ahead for us. So before we do that, were there any questions on interpreting this model here? No, take that as a no. If they do pop up, just put it in the chat box and let us know. So as Steve did spoil for us all, we've got 2 models. We do have what's called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Guide to Healthy Eating, as you can see there on the left, as well as the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is the one that is more commonly used and the one that I just broke down a little bit for you. What I actually am going to ask you guys to do is to have a look at the two different models and note down some of the things that you see as differences. So make a bit of a comparison and contrast between the two models. Just having a quick look whether, no, there was no space for that in your book, so never seen that one. That's interesting. 13 years. Kat's very passionate in this space, and she's going to do a lot of talking on this one for us. I can see she's ready to go.
Well, while people are thinking, I did share a story with Nikki earlier in that I have been really fortunate to live and work in some First Nations communities around this country. And that included the time when this version of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Guide to Healthy Eating was being formulated. So I guess to answer a couple of the little questions that have come through the chat, you know, we went out to community, and it was one of those experiences where I was really pleased to see that the focus groups we did with community members actually resulted in changes to the original version that they'd sent us out to community with. So we went out with a version of this guide to healthy eating, and then what you're seeing on your screen now is where it came to. And for those who have been out to remote community stores, for example, and potentially shopped in these little stores rather than, you know, the big grocery stores that we're more used to in regional and urban areas. What they've tried to do with this guide is actually reflect what food products look like. So we've got food literacy in action on this guide, but we've also got health literacy. So just keeping in mind where people might be at from using this as a visual perspective. So you can see the two difference as one example with the rolled oats. So on the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, it's on quite a plain packet, whereas on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Guide to Healthy Eating, the packet is reflective of what they might be more likely to see in their community-based store. There are some attempts here at including more traditional foods and bush tucker. So as has been mentioned, you know, there's the kangaroo, there's the goanna, there is some in the fruit and vegetable sections, they've got some examples of traditional fruits and vegetables that can be found on country. And so this, as I mentioned, has been an attempt to pull together a visual guide that's going to land more with people based in communities. So I hope that answers some of the questions.
It was fantastic. Thanks. No crocodile or turtle is the question that we've got there. And I guess that just comes down to what fits. You've also got to pick some. I mean, turtles, I would imagine, would take up quite some space. So I think there's just some graphic design in there and not, you know, explicitly excluding those foods for any particular reason. The other thing that I really wanted to emphasize with these guides is essentially the same nutritional message is being promoted. As Kat said, it is about those food literacy elements, those health literacy elements, and making this model accessible to people in all different places and cultures with those food accessibility and availability variances. So I'm just reading the comments as we go. So just to make sure I understand, it's about access, absolutely. So this model is absolutely about people accessing it both visually and what they can access within their community. And that really ties in with those systems elements of that food literacy. And this is part of why we really wanted to emphasize this, making sure we're giving information in ways that people can understand, as we're going to do for our students for next week, but also acknowledging and taking into consideration there are differences in what foods are available to people within their communities, within their homes, you know, for various cultural reasons, for various physiological reasons. And this model is just trying to capture those differences in access for people who don't necessarily have the availability of foods that you might find in, you know, regional and more developed areas. Any other questions on that, or any other comments you want to make before we move on with that one? Very interesting that 13 years in Weeper and it still wasn't a seen model. Excellent. All right, so we'll move forward now. So again, just to really follow up and reiterate these systems aspects, because they do play such a huge part. So physiological, sorry, I was referring to things like allergies and I sort of went off on a tangent, but just, yeah, I've tried to bring myself back in. Yeah, we're really looking at those systems elements and really wanting to understand that there is more to people's food choices, including our students, than just food preferences. So a little bit of additional data here around the accessibility and availability of foods within Queensland. So this is actually a really recent study that I was very excited to be able to include this. So we can see inequalities in Queensland, so it's 2021 data, that the recommended diet costs 20% less than the current diets. So we're hitting on some of those myth points there that we brought up earlier, that there is some of these myths and perceptions that meeting the recommended intake, including all those fruits and vegetables that we should be having, costs more. It actually costs 20% less. However, I'm multitasking with the slides. In rural and remote regions, or outer regions of Queensland, it actually costs 38% more compared to in the cities. Costs 30%, it's 30% of the median income for low socioeconomic areas, which we know are more prevalent outside of those city areas as well. And it's 35% of the median income in remote areas. And only 15% of the median income in the least disadvantaged areas. So that 30% and 35% there are actually considered to exceed the stress threshold and not be viable for people to actually purchase and live on. So yes, while the recommended diet costs 20% less than what we're currently consuming, it's not equitably spread across Queensland. And we do need to be aware of that, and aware of that for our families and our students when we're trying to encourage more nutritious food choices.
And I think just on, the point of the last two discussions that we've been having, particularly around the different guides to healthy eating and then the differences that exist within this very state, depending on where you've got access to food, really this is why there's no one size fits all with nutrition education resources. And this is why we're gifting you with this information and this knowledge, because your community, depending on where you are in this state, is going to look different to another community. And so it's really about applying that lens, and you guys know your communities, your families better than anyone. So just keeping all of these things in mind from now on, anytime that you're looking at food and nutrition resources.
Yeah, and Charlene's just made a few comments on there about bendy carrots and things like that, and you're absolutely correct. And if we did go back to that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander model, you've also said there is a few more frozen products and tinned products included in that model to allow for those differences as well, and acknowledge that those, canned, tinned fruits and vegetables, frozen, all still have nutritional value and quality as well. And they may be more appealing because, nobody likes a bendy carrot. There's nothing good about that. Sorry, and I just can't see the last one. So the recommended diet costs 38%. It costs, where are we going? 38% more. Yes. I'm just rereading to make sure I'm clarifying that. Yeah, the recommended diet costs 38% more in the remote areas compared with the cities and outer regions. So to achieve the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating recommendations, if you live in a remote area, will cost you 38% more.
So if it costs you $100 in Logan, it might cost you $140 if you're up on the Torres Strait Islands, for example. And that would be if you can access it, correct?
Absolutely. And it's not bendy and you want to access it. But how does it compare to the current diet?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Steve, you might need
to... I would have to go back to the actual study, and there is the references in there definitely to clarify that. But I think what they've done is taken an average. So the 20%, hang on, let me read the current. What was the question? How does it compare with the current diet? Yeah, you'd have to go back to the actual research. So I haven't written that figure down. I'm fairly certain it's in there. But yeah, you'll have to follow that one up. I think it's great that you're interested in this data. It is really valuable and important for us to understand and build our perspectives. I just can't remember off the top of my head what was explicitly included. But the fact that it is such a recent Queensland paper is such an invaluable thing for us. We're very fortunate to have had someone do this research so recently.
And I'll just quickly point out that you'll see on a lot of the slides reference numbers. So this is number 15, and you'll get a reference list, and you can go and check that particular study out if anyone's interested.
Yeah, sorry, I've confused myself now, Steve. So really just highlighting the inequalities and the systems issues. We can get bogged down in the numbers another time, perhaps. All right, so this does bring us back to our food literacy model that we're going to unpack. On page 5 to 6 of your work booklets, this one is one that's really important for you to jump over into. Sorry, I keep using different terms. That participant manual, what's in the handouts or documents files. I hope everyone knows what I'm talking about now, the one that came through in the email. What we want you to do is actually spend a few minutes having a look through the list of competencies that are in that food literacy model. So yes, we've got this graphic organized 3 different competency areas, but within each of those competency areas, there's actually a huge variety of different skills, attributes, qualities, and things that we're looking for that make up that competency. So you've got a tick box in one of your columns there. I think it's the left column. Everyone's following me on page 5. That you can go through and have a look at them and what's included in them and tick whether they're included in your professional practice or not. And then in the next column, so the left-hand side one, you can give yourself a rating, 1 to 3. I'm just clarifying the phrasing around what you are rating it on. Your confidence in including that competency in your professional practice. So I'll give you a few quick minutes to do that. Once you've done that, we just want you to jump back into the poll here and let us know if you include those competencies most of the time, sometimes, or not very often, or not many. So this will also, once you've done the poll, that's also our gauge that you have finished having a look at that competencies checklist.
And Nikki, I'll just do a quick share screen for those that
yes, thank you.
Maybe trying to understand what we are referring to. So we are referring to this workbook here. So I'm currently on page 6, where we are looking at the functional competencies. And if you think that you already included in your practice, you might give this box a tick. And then, as Nikki mentioned, a confidence rating between 1 and 3. So perhaps just go and have a quick skim read over those. We are quickly running out of time.
I know.
More to get.
I felt like we could spend a lot of time unpacking that data on the previous slide, which I could very easily be led down a rabbit hole, but we won't do that today. We'll come back to it another time.
Nothing to
apologise about. So answers through there in the polls. Pardon?
Oh, nothing. Steve's apologising, and there's nothing to apologise about because the discussions are so rich and so important. And this is what's putting us, we're really putting ourselves now in the positions of our communities. And I love that.
Me too, Steve.
Yeah. Great. So we've had a number of answers already in our poll, and lots of people are saying that they include most of these food competencies already. Some are admitting that not many yet, and some are including some. So that's great.
Perfect. So we'll just we continue to fill in that poll. We've got a second poll coming up as well, I think. So were there any competencies included within this framework or model that you weren't expecting, you hadn't considered to be part of this idea of teaching food nutrition and food literacy? So I've just got a second poll in there for you to answer as well.
Yeah, so some people have already said that there's some that they hadn't expected or hadn't considered. Some are saying no surprises in there.
And I think as we sort of introduced at the beginning, some of these food literacy concepts are very big topics and big issues and very abstract, and it is working out ways to make it, reach our students next week.
Fantastic. So we might move on to the next one, Nikki.
Keep me on time here, Kat. Yeah. So we've got 2 other questions there that we're just going to get you to reflect on. So which of these competencies are you most confident to include, and which of these are you least confident to include? So we'll just leave those there for you to think about within your professional practice. Again, time is not on our side. This does bring us to objective 2 for today's session. So in this one, we're really looking at why communicate about food literacy. What information should we be communicating, and how we should be best communicating with our communities, families, and even with our students just a smidge. You guys have already really hit on some of these points and considerations earlier in the discussion. So, why communicate? So first of all, when we communicate within our schools, it generates a reinforcing environment and consistent messages around food. That's the next one. It promotes school commitment, value, and prioritisation to student health and wellbeing. It gives us an opportunity to share successes, learning experiences, and achievements. It builds community connections and a sense of belonging. And it gives us opportunity to gather information, perspectives, and feedbacks about what we're doing, how we're going, our families. And it provides, and we can provide direct information to our parents and carers. Unfortunately, we don't always have time or the opportunity to include all the competencies. Yeah, absolutely. Time is a big issue. So we did have an activity in here. Do we want to maybe just skim over this and set it for homework, as I like to do for the sake of time? So in your workbooks, we won't do it right now. It is on page 9. You've got this list of reasons to communicate within your school. And we wanted to give you some opportunity to think through those and look through those around how you could actually do this in professional practice. So what I might do, just for the sake of time, is go through the examples that we had, and you could pop those in if you wanted to. I will move quite quickly because we do only have 15 minutes left. Or you can come back to it later. So whenever we do any of these things, we're going to be generating a reinforcing environment and consistent messages. So that one isn't included in your table because it's overarching for all of them. But when it comes to promoting school commitment, value, and priorities to student health and wellbeing, we might be doing things like using our canteen to promote seasonal fruits and vegetables, regular food literacy lessons, snacks of the week, things in our newsletters, things like that. We also had the example earlier of having our fruit breaks and things. In terms of sharing our successes, this could be anything but those photo opportunity type moments. It could be your learning experiences. It could be an excursion or something you're going on. It could be growing that beautiful produce. A way to capture that lovely story about the lettuce and putting that on the sandwiches would be, yeah, beautiful. Make a storybook or something. It's anything that you can share those successes that you're having. Building our community connections. This is an opportunity to communicate in a way that's going to celebrate the diversities within your school communities, within your wider communities. It could be about inviting people in to share different cultural aspects, visiting farms, having guest speakers come in. It could be connecting with different community groups to have breakfast clubs or anything along those lines. You can communicate in ways to gather information and feedback. So this could be really some of those P&C type things around your canteen menus, ideas for non-food fundraising, anything along those lines. So really trying to skim through. And then the very last one there is one that's quite important and links into our next slide. And that's about providing direct information to parents and carers. Yes, this is something that schools can communicate around, and it does reinforce those consistent messages and environments, but we do need to be really careful in the way that we do this and ensure that we're sticking within our professional practice, or scope of professional practice rather. So the examples I've got in here are around just providing food safety information, information about water being really important for hydration, and those sorts of things. We're going to unpack on the slide here what we actually deem to be within the scope of professional practice of a teacher and what is outside the scope of professional practice. So we're going to use a poll for this one as well. We're going to give you, I guess, a little sentence or a brief or bullet points, and you guys are going to tell us through the poll whether you think it's something that's within the scope of practice or whether it's outside the scope of practice. Hit it, Kat. So the first one there, we've got a little thumbs up, so you think it is. Thumbs down if you think it is not, and a little confused face if you are not sure. So providing general health information only. Is that within the scope of practice or not within the scope of practice?
We've got a few people who've answered already, suggesting that this is within their scope of practice. Someone's not really sure. All right, let's do the big reveal.
Big reveal, are you driving here? So it is within the scope of practice, provided we're staying with general nutrition information, things that align with the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating that are government endorsed materials, and nothing that sort of steps outside that government endorsed answer. We've got the next one up there.
Passing judgment on a student's lunchbox.
Is it within your professional practice to do this?
And I have seen this in action. So there are people in schools that do think it's within their scope of practice.
You've just given the answer away, but thanks.
Not necessarily.
Think you might have. All right, so as Kat has just alluded to, it's not within the scope of practice to be passing judgment. We have highlighted some of these systems issues, and you guys have also pointed out parents are the ones that purchase food for our students largely. So our students don't necessarily have control or choice of what they're being provided, and it's not within the scope of professional practice. So passing judgment on a family's dietary practices. We're getting a bit quicker on these ones now. Yep, and I think everyone is very clear on this. It's not within the scope of professional practice. And, this might be even when you're seeing things that don't necessarily align with the Australian Dietary Guidelines, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. It's just not your place as a teacher to be providing that information and advice. You can certainly suggest that maybe they go and get some professional advice from a dietitian or something like that, but it's not within your professional practice. Well, did I just give that one away? I think we're getting pretty good at these now. So referring parents, carers and community to credible sources of information and resources is definitely within the scope of our practice. So sticking within the confines, particularly that Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. This is why I say it's important for underpinning your knowledge and understanding, but not necessarily a student-facing resource. Creating a positive and inclusive food culture and environment. We've got a lot of information on this particular idea over the next few slides, which we've got 10 minutes left to cram in. I'm just skipping ahead to see what I can prioritise for us.
So you got one more poll there. Should we give students instructions on what foods they should or shouldn't eat from their lunchbox? And I know we've had some conversations in the chat that, we might look in a lunchbox with thoughts, I should say, as to, packets and, what we're seeing in different lunchboxes. But should we be telling students to eat their sandwich first, for example, or, don't eat their chips until they get home? Do you want to finish? Yeah.
I'm just waiting to see if we've all finished on this one. So, last couple of answers in. Most people agreeing that, have you skipped the answer to that one? There it is. No, I went too far forward. No, Pete.
You gave the last one away.
We're even now. So this is not within the scope of our professional practice. We will unpack the rationale and reasons behind this. It may be a very, very brief overview of why this is not within our professional practice, but you definitely have a whole bunch of resources in that participant workbook, or many of its other names, that you can go back and have a look at and actually see the underpinning theory, rationale, evidence behind this. Everything that we are presenting here today is evidence-based. Okay, so there is the theory that backs up behind that. So we'll do the last one that I've just given away for you.
I won't do the poll for that. That's okay.
You didn't have a poll? Okay. And then the last one is giving parents and carers nutrition advice. So again, whether you have taken up the latest fad diet or whatever it is, and, you know, it's not within the scope of your professional practice to be passing on that nutritional advice and information. If you do think that maybe it's a case that the parents and families require some additional support or advice, referring them or suggesting that they go and see, you know, their GP, a dietitian, but it's definitely not your place to be stepping over that line to give any sort of nutritional information or advice. All right, so the next few slides intend to help unpack why these are the scopes of professional practice that we need to be sitting within. So schools and teachers have a role in supporting and reinforcing when and where a child has the opportunity to eat while at school. So this is taken from Ellen Satter's Division of Responsibility in Feeding. This is considered a gold standard of evidence-based practice in child feeding. Within this model, it's really clearly articulated what is a parent's role and responsibility versus what is a child's role and responsibility. So a parent and a carer has a responsibility for deciding what foods are available to the child within the home. So yes, they do the grocery shopping and will purchase those foods, so they do need to make that decision. When that food is available, so meal times, snack times, that's a parent's job to regulate that type of availability, and where it's available, so where those meals are held and things like that. The child has the responsibility to decide how much food they are going to eat and whether they are going to eat the food. So going back to some of those professional practice type questions, these are the reasons why it's not appropriate to be telling a child what to eat first out of their lunchbox, or policing the lunchbox in any way. So the child's responsibility really is around whether they eat and how much they eat. Anything outside the scope of that, or commenting on anything outside of the scope of that, is really putting a parent's responsibility and jobs onto that child, which is just not fair, and it's not, you know, practical or feasible for the child to do anything about what the parents have decided within their roles in that child feeding dynamic. For a really quick summary, I hope that made some degree of sense. Go back into the participant workbook. You can read through this in far more detail. If you're a parent with a child, I encourage you to apply this model at home as well. While we're applying this model, so making sure we're sticking within those realms of what we can control and what the child has the responsibility to control, as I initially said, school is there to sort of reinforce and support the parents' roles and responsibilities and leave the child's roles up to them. The school does also have some responsibilities about what foods are available within the school's canteen, excursions, camps, and things like that. But again, the child has to have the opportunity to decide if they're going to eat those foods and how much of those foods they're going to eat. We also have a whole bunch of information there around these other ways to communicate about food that are really important before we come into applying them within our pedagogical practices. So we need to understand the ways in which we can communicate about food and nutrition that are supportive and promotive for a child's growth, development, health, relationships with food. So we term these things as strengths-focused and positive. You might be familiar with the strengths-focused ideas from within the curriculum. It is explicit within the PE curriculum. But food positivity is also another aspect. And that's about promoting the enjoyment of food, a growth mindset in eating. You know, I might not like the food yet, but, you know, I have an opportunity to learn to like different foods, and being open and flexible. Non-judgmental and value neutral. So this is really important, and it's about not passing judgment on any food, whether it's within our explicit learning, whether it's about the foods a child has in their lunchbox, and maintaining what is value neutral. So it's not putting foods into that good or bad category. So, you know, we shouldn't be eating this food and we should be eating this food. And it crosses those lines. It becomes quite challenging to do in terms of healthy foods and unhealthy foods. But it's a dichotomization that we really want to stay away from with our language, to keep our children open to all sorts of foods and food experiences, and really developing opportunity and ability to develop their food preferences without any influence from parents. There, again, is a whole bunch of pre-reading, it's going to be post-reading around this issue and this topic, and the actual associations that using this type of language creates around food that can be have the opposite effect, essentially, to what we want. Once we start to dichotomize foods as good or bad, we actually entice children to choose foods that we maybe don't want them choosing as much.
And it's even, if I can just jump in quickly, Nikki.
Absolutely. I'm trying to rush.
I know you are, I know, but this is a really important part. And in some ways, I feel we talked about the Australian Guide to Eating, and we've got some foods that are off the plate and some foods that are on the plate. And that is actually already a dichotomy. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and what we're going to explore next week is this age-appropriate way to approach this type of learning. And somebody mentioned that it's in the Year 3 curriculum. So maybe by the end of next week, we can revisit this idea and think, is that appropriate in Year 3 curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
The Australian Guide to Healthy Eating explicitly uses that sometimes phrasing with its description of discretionary foods, which goes against what is this best practice. And again, I think that's just about, at this stage, really reinforcing that visual model is for adult interpretation, and it's not that student-facing resource that it often gets used as, because it does just send these mixed messages, and it does override a child's ability to learn to eat naturally, and falls outside of this division of responsibility framework in terms of coercively shaping their thinking around food and food values. I'm just clicking over to the chat box to see if anyone had anything they wanted to say, add, or ask around that. We were going to ask you guys, when we talk about this binary coding of food and good foods and bad foods, what other terms and phrases have you heard or you see get used around this binary coding? Yep, so clean eating, food versus food products. I think that would be a very abstract and hard one for children to understand either way. Edible foods like products.
I'm putting it in there, but it's even this notion of healthy versus unhealthy.
Absolutely. And I'm guilty of falling into doing that frequently and often. You could probably have gone through and pinned me every time I said it, even throughout this presentation. There is this broader language and vocabulary around food that does slip in, and it does shape the way we think, and that's part of the reason we want to move children away from using that type of language, to really pick up the sometimes foods and the red foods. Yep. And I'm chuckling here because in our very next slide, we begin to talk about, although we're right on for 4:30, the Smart Choices Framework, which is still our framework that is policy within Queensland schools, but it does absolutely use this
traffic light system.
Traffic light system, yep. And again, I would just say that that's an adult-facing guide and material, and not necessarily student-facing. So I have seen quite a few school menus where they colour code their foods for their children to choose foods from, which is not necessarily an appropriate practice, because it does imply this dichotomization or coding of foods as good, bad, healthy, and unhealthy. Anything else we wanted to add there on that? Look, I've really, really skimmed over this topic, this area, which is really a really, really important way of thinking about food that's possibly quite challenging and different to what you might have grown up thinking and what gets embedded in our worldviews. And as I mentioned, this broader vocabulary around food and nutrition really does impinge on our thinking about food, and really does emphasize this binary coding of foods that we want to be moving away from. So I really would encourage you to go through the participant workbook and read the information that's in there, access some of the additional resources that further unpack and clarify what we're talking about with food positivity and value neutral and things like that. Those are the underpinning values and beliefs, essentially, that we want you to be bringing into your pedagogical practices. So this is why we have started with this module, so that we can really get us all thinking in the same way, using the same languages around food to help shape our pedagogy in a way that is most effective and beneficial to students and their learning. So do we want to, so we are at 4:30 now. I'm quite happy to keep going through. What do you want to do here, Kat?
Look, I think it's really up to our participants online.
Yeah.
I think if we can try and get through the last few slides in the next 10 minutes, knowing that, we've got some thumbs up.
Steve has voted for everyone, so I think Steve.
No, I'm not sure if he's voting for that or the question I put in the chat either, but
I'm going to take it as he voted to keep plugging away.
Okay, let's go.
All right, so we've very, very quickly covered over some really important things to be communicating, some ways to communicate. Our communication can then be both explicit communication or implicit communication, and we have touched on these things. So I'm just going to burn through them really quickly. So when we're talking about communicating with our parents, carers, and communities explicitly, this is where we're promoting those food positive messages and approaches. We're promoting a value for our evidence-based practices and general information around nutrition. So this is, again, what's in line with our professional practices. I understand that point there at this stage is not a very tangible or applicable point, but we do come back to it soon. All right, so just hold on with me there. And when we talk about explicit communication with our students, this is where we're talking about our age-appropriate food and nutrition curriculum and pedagogies, as we will cover next lesson. Sound like a teacher, don't I? So our implicit communication, this is where we do come to that applying the smart choices. As I said, this is our current standing policies within Queensland schools around how to use and involve food. Can I get thumbs up now if we're familiar with this framework and model? Very quickly, so I don't spend too much time. This is the traffic light system. I think primary schools are far better at using it and understanding it than Queensland schools. So yes, it does apply to our canteens, and it's about those green, amber, and red choices, where our red foods are only available twice a term. But it also extends beyond that and includes our classroom, our excursions. Hope we're not using food rewards, because this wouldn't be in line with our division of responsibility, but it's something to be aware of because I know it happens. So that's part of our implicit communication. That's part of shaping our school environment in a way that reinforces students to make the food choices that we're hoping they would make. So a nutritious and diverse and inclusive school menu and canteen. So also that's moving a little bit broader and thinking about diversity in terms of our cultural inclusions, vegetarian, vegan options, lactose-free, those things that allow us to value everyone's diversity in food.
Even thinking about packets and how things can be opened.
Yes, absolutely. Really good one. Not using food as a reward or an incentive, as we just mentioned before, definitely not in line with best practice for either teaching or for nutrition. So by simply not doing that, that's an implicit communication that reinforces our value for food positivity and the health and well-being of our students. Similarly, not using food within our fundraising options, so finding fundraising options that are not food focused. There are heaps of them out there. You just Google non-food fundraising options and you'll definitely find a whole bunch of them. Celebrating diverse food cultures. So again, getting to know your students, getting to know your communities, and really embracing the variety of practices, beliefs, foods that are out there. Clean, comfortable, and supportive eating areas. So to communicate our value for food and nutrition and food literacy, having places where our students can eat that is clean, that is responsive, that is supportive of their eating behaviours is really important. It's obviously something that I realise is logistically well beyond the capacity of a classroom teacher to infrastruct, but it is something that's really important to be mindful of and aware of. I dislike fast food restaurants, not explicitly because of the foods they contain, but because they're dirty, they're noisy, they're chaotic, and all of those things really go against my way of eating and enjoying food in a peaceful and relaxed environment where I can engage both socially and with the foods that I'm eating. Be a positive food role model. Enjoy a wide variety of food. Make sure you're practicing those food positivity, things. I haven't tried that food yet. Is that really that growth mindset around food and eating that falls in line with that food positivity? Making sure you're using value neutral language, describing foods. I'm having a crunchy salad for lunch as opposed to I'm having a healthy salad for lunch. Asking questions about foods that kids have. Where does that food come from? How does it taste? How does it look? How does it smell? Oops, I thought there was another one there. All of those kinds of things. So that language that we use when we speak about food is really important within that implicit communication, and that will come through in the learning experiences that we develop for our students as well.
Can I just add one quick thought then? And I'm just reflecting back on the clean, comfortable and supportive eating areas. And one thing I'd love everyone to reflect on a little bit is also the amount of time that's given for students to be able to eat. And really some schools do their eating before their play, and some schools do play before eating. Which way does your school do it? And are kids given enough of a space, time-wise, to be able to engage with food properly as well? So just a little bit of food for thought, if you like.
An accidental punning. Yeah, really, really important, I think. And it's a hard one. And again, it's well beyond the scope of a classroom teacher to actually maybe manipulate those aspects. But, there's probably some things that you can find to put forward to your admin even, or encouraging teacher aides to take the students to garden areas. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of different things you can do. But, sitting on the floor, I know that's a very Australian school eating environment, but whether it's the most conducive with, food literacy and our values for food is probably a bit questionable. But things to keep in mind anyway. Eating after play, about 15 to 20 minutes, plus brain food and afternoon tea.
Afternoon tea is a good one. And I like that eating after play. Often if kids are trying to play but they're trying to eat their food and they get really, really torn.
Absolutely, because play is such an important thing for children as well. And do you want them coming to class hungry or restless? It's, pick your battles there, I suppose. So look, this does sort of bring us to a very, very brief ending of our module work for today. What we had here is an example of how to communicate that really brings together and consolidates all the messages that we had been trying to convey to you today. So I've put together a little food communication here that might be something that you would pop on a school Facebook page or something like that to start to build some parent engagement. So it just says, crisp, juicy apples are in season and make a great lunchbox snack. Are you red or are you green? So it invites them for a little bit of participation. We've popped a little poll in there just for fun. It gets dialogue going around food in a very value neutral way. Obviously, there is, a red apple isn't better than a green apple. They are both, very good fruit choices, but it's starting that dialogue. Did you want to unpack some of this as well, where you see these connections, Kat, to other learning and learning experiences?
Look, I think Nikki and I earlier had a discussion around where could you take this concept? So these two sentences, how could you then transform that into some learning opportunities for your classroom and for your community? And Nikki gave one example of, putting this out to the school potentially on a Facebook poll, for example. But what might this look like if you translated this into a classroom activity? And we started to think, well, you could incorporate it into numeracy. You've got opportunities here to start to collect data, for example, to create shapes by cutting up apples, to start to build your literacy around it. So what, in this sentence, we've used the words crisp and juicy, not just identifying it by colour. So how can we start to build language around this concept of apples? How could we start to turn this into an art piece? What could we create with apples that could become part of a really interactive, and fun activity within the classroom? So, I think it's around taking a concept, and somebody mentioned earlier around how hard it is to incorporate this in this curriculum that we know is already bursting. So how can we get smarter around how we work? How can we work across the curriculum? And we are really, in the next 2 modules, going to be exploring that a little bit more, particularly when we're touching on those cross-curriculum priorities.
And
sorry.
I was just saying bye to Sue. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, no problem. Thank you. And I guess, this is just the lead on now into, you've got the foundations from today. How are we going to continue to build on those over the next couple of weeks?